All my life, my parents told me I was chasing fantasies behind a glowing screen, too lost in lines of code to ever find my way in the real world. At every family gathering, I became the punchline, a cautionary tale for what happens when you waste your potential. But when the truth about what I'd built finally exploded across the table, no one at that rehearsal dinner was ready for the storm I brought with me. I never understood how a family could be so proud and so blind at the same time, but growing up as Paige in the Sawyer house, I learned fast that you could be both the oddball and the cautionary tale without ever leaving your living room. My dad, Warren, ruled over our Austin house like the mayor of some faded small town, always carrying a stethoscope and a sense of disappointment when he looked at me. My mother, Marcia, preferred to command from the kitchen or the phone, usually while rattling off some new courtroom victory, a casserole recipe, or, most often, gossip about her youngest daughter, the girl who wasted her promise on those silly computer toys. Every time my brother Brian walked into a room, the conversation would immediately shift to his orthopedic surgery residency, his new research paper, or the private golf club membership he'd finally earned. He was only 3 years older than me, but he might as well have lived on a different planet. Even when I was a kid, it felt like my family's entire social life revolved around his achievements. My trophies for debate and math competitions barely got a spot on the mantle, and the one that really mattered, my state programming championship at 17, ended up as a coaster under a coffee mug in my dad's study. I remember the last time I saw that trophy before everything changed. Dad's study was like a shrine to everything he valued: polished wood, medical diplomas, shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, and a little golden figure almost lost under a stack of dusty medical journals. I was 27, and it still stung to see my biggest victory reduced to a punchline. That day, Mom had told her bridge club friends that I was the odd little computer girl who'd never fit in. I overheard her from the hallway, pretending to look for her purse, my face burning in the shadows. Whenever we had family dinners, usually at some steakhouse in Dallas or a country club outside Austin, my family found new ways to needle me about my career. Mom would offer helpful suggestions about job fairs at the local courthouse, or recommend that I talk to her friend's son about real opportunities in administration. Dad always made a point of reminding me that Brian was on call, and that saving lives was the kind of work that actually mattered. Once, my Aunt Connie looked at me across a gleaming dinner table and asked, in a tone reserved for stray dogs and disappointing desserts, "Paige, do you ever wish you'd chosen something practical?" By the time I hit 31, I'd heard every version of that question, and every answer sounded like a joke. I had a startup called Nova Matrix that nobody in my family knew about. I'd lived in a string of apartments that my parents never visited because I moved every time the lease was up or the city started to feel too small. Every time I called home, the conversation drifted toward my job search or the latest story about Brian. I learned to stop correcting them. It was easier to play along than to explain what I was actually doing, working all night, pitching to investors, and building a company out of thin air. I don't think my family ever realized how much they'd shaped me by refusing to see me. When I was a teenager, I coded in secret, hiding printouts in my closet and clearing browser history like I was smuggling state secrets. I started out copying JavaScript from books I checked out at the library because my parents never bought me a computer. When I finally scraped together enough money from babysitting and tutoring to buy a used Dell, I hid it under my bed. They thought I was up late reading novels or writing in a diary. They never once asked what I was building or why the light stayed on until 3 in the morning. In my last year of high school, I entered a state programming competition using a predictive scheduling app I'd hacked together after hearing my school counselor complain about double-booked classrooms. I spent weeks writing code, testing for bugs, and redesigning the interface so it would look professional, even though nobody but the judges would ever see it. The night before the competition, Dad scheduled a big dinner for Brian's college acceptance, Northwestern. Of course, the same school my parents had attended. When I reminded them about my competition, Mom just waved a hand and told me not to be selfish, as if asking to celebrate my work was some kind of crime. I competed anyway, alone in a gymnasium filled with teams whose parents wore matching t-shirts and carried thermoses of coffee. My family didn't even text to ask if I'd survived the day. When I brought home the trophy, the gold still shining, Dad barely looked up from his medical journals. He mumbled something about another one for the shelf, then took it to his study, where it disappeared under a stack of journals. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that I could build something real without their approval. I didn't know that it would take me another decade to prove it. Years later, as I walked into that same study to grab an old flash drive, I saw my trophy again, buried, forgotten, covered in coffee stains. In that moment, all the old anger and hurt flared up so suddenly that I almost left without what I came for. But I took a deep breath and reminded myself that things were different now. I wasn't the invisible girl anymore, even if my family couldn't see it. I was hours away from signing a contract that would change everything, and for once, I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready. What my parents didn't know was that my company was about to be acquired for more than any of us could count. I carried the signed agreement in my purse, heavy and satisfying, a secret I'd held onto for almost 6 months as the deal inched toward completion. They had no idea. At my brother's rehearsal dinner, where Mom would sit me beside the kitchen door, and Dad would toast Brian for his discipline and commitment to real work, I would finally have the upper hand. For as long as I could remember, every time I achieved something on my own, it got erased by a bigger, louder version of someone else's story. This time, my story was too big to ignore, and I intended to let them hear it loud and clear. If my parents were ever honest, I think they'd admit they cared more about how they looked in public than about what their children really loved. After high school, when the rest of my classmates were packing up for the Ivy League or heading to engineering programs around the country, I was sitting at the family dining table in Austin, holding a state college acceptance packet and feeling like I'd just swallowed a bag of rocks. It hadn't mattered that I'd been accepted to MIT, hadn't mattered that Stanford wanted me on a full ride. My parents kept those letters locked away in a drawer, and when I confronted them, all Mom said was that she was protecting me from bad decisions. I was 19 and living 10 miles from home, but it felt like I was living on a different planet from everyone else in my life. At college, everything felt harder than it should have been. The other kids called home for help with tuition or laptops, and someone always answered. When my old Dell crashed, I spent a month scrounging for parts. I started skipping the cafeteria, saving up for a used hard drive, telling myself it was all part of the struggle. That's when I met Sierra. She was the kind of person who could fix anything, whether it was a broken microwave or a stubborn line of code. Her family ran a smoky old barbecue shack out by the interstate, and when I crashed my first computer science midterm, she showed me how to actually debug my program instead of just starting over. Sierra didn't care that I wore the same 2 pairs of jeans all semester, or that I didn't know the difference between white wine and seltzer. We became friends fast, then roommates, renting the kind of duplex where the hot water only lasted 7 minutes and the windows rattled every time a truck passed by. The truth is, those years after college are the ones I remember most sharply, not the degrees or the job fairs, but the constant sense of building something that nobody else could see. Sierra and I worked late every night, fueled by gas station coffee and whatever leftovers she could swipe from her uncle's place. We started freelancing for local businesses, sometimes getting paid in cash, sometimes in brisket. Our first official office was a corner of her uncle's garage, surrounded by old tires and rusted bikes. I set up my ancient monitor on top of 2 milk crates. Sierra kept the internet running by stringing an Ethernet cable through a hole in the window. We called ourselves Nova Matrix because we thought it sounded bigger than it was, even though our biggest contract at the time was for a dentist who paid us with a stack of 20s in a brown envelope. Despite the long hours and constant setbacks, there was a thrill in making something out of nothing. The code we wrote didn't care who our parents were or how many times we'd failed. When a property manager named Daryl called about a security system that kept glitching, Sierra and I built a prototype over a single weekend. Our software used simple cameras and custom scripts to monitor entrances and track energy use. Daryl was so impressed, he paid us more than I'd made in the previous 3 months combined. Holding that first real check, I realized for the first time that we might actually be able to do this for a living. But the road ahead was brutal. Investors didn't want to meet with 2 young women from Austin with no connections. The first time we pitched our product to a major firm, the partners spent more time asking about Sierra's last name than about our software. One VC even laughed and told us that building management was a dead end for girls like you. Each rejection made us more stubborn. We redid our pitch decks, built new demos, and kept working from that freezing garage, determined not to let anyone else define what was possible. All that time, my parents kept their distance, acting as if I'd moved to Houston to work as a secretary or to find myself. When I called home, the conversation was always about Brian, his new fellowship, his research at the hospital, the condo he'd bought downtown. I let them believe what they wanted. It was easier than arguing, easier than explaining that I was spending my nights chasing server bugs and my days chasing invoices. Sierra became my family in every way that mattered. She pushed me to celebrate small wins. She kept track of our meager cash flow. She stood beside me the night we signed our first real client outside Texas, a developer in Phoenix who'd found us online. As Nova Matrix grew, we found ourselves bringing on new faces: Mark, who could fix any server issue before lunch, Keisha, who made our dashboards look beautiful, and Lisa, who could sell our vision to the most skeptical building owners. Every time we hired someone new, I felt a little lighter, as if the company was becoming more real. Even so, I kept almost everything secret from my family. I didn't invite them to our tiny office in Houston. I didn't tell them about our patents or the magazine article that called Nova Matrix the future of smart buildings. At holidays, Mom would seat me at the far end of the table and ask, in her best concerned parent voice, whether I'd considered applying for a job at the local courthouse. I stopped answering after a while. Sometimes, late at night, I'd reread old emails from investors who told us we'd never make it, just to remind myself how far we'd come. Sierra and I would sit on the garage roof with cold beers, talking about what we'd do if we ever made real money. The answer was always the same: we'd buy better chairs, take a vacation, and maybe, just maybe, call home with good news for once. Looking back now, I realize that every setback made us tougher, every success a little sweeter. I learned the only approval that really mattered was from the people who believed in what we were building, not the people who wanted to keep us small. What I didn't know then was that our biggest break was just around the corner, and that the quiet power of all those years in the shadows was about to turn my whole world upside down. I'll never forget the way the air felt the night of Brian's rehearsal dinner, thick with perfume and expectation, every surface of the Dallas Skylight Club gleaming under gold fixtures. It was the kind of place where my parents felt at home, where every server seemed to know their drink order and every guest arrived wrapped in careful ambition. I wore a navy dress that looked simple, but cost me more than my first 2 laptops combined, and I took the elevator to the rooftop dining room with my heart pounding in my chest, my company's acquisition contract tucked quietly in my bag. The hostess led me to a private table where my entire family was already arranged, each person occupying a seat as if auditioning for the role of most successful. Dad was halfway through a story about Brian's last triathlon, Mom beaming as she described her latest legal victory to a new friend of the family. At the center of it all was Brian, laughing with his fiancée Callie, who looked polished in a red dress and a diamond bracelet that probably cost more than Sierra's car. The only seat left for me was at the edge, beside a cousin who scrolled her phone under the table, barely looking up as I arrived. Dinner began with the usual parade of toasts. Dad bragged about Brian's medical fellowship in Houston, Mom praised Callie for her new position at a major investment firm, and a few uncles traded stories about country club tournaments and high-rise condos. Every now and then, someone would glance my way and ask about the job hunt, or suggest that I consider applying for work at a bank where a distant relative might pull some strings. I smiled and thanked them, never once mentioning the deal that would turn Nova Matrix into a household name by morning. As the main course arrived, Callie leaned toward me, her eyes sharp with curiosity that I hadn't expected. She asked about my work, but this time, the questions were pointed. She wanted to know about automation, about security tech in modern office towers, and about the future of AI in property management. It dawned on me in that moment that Callie's firm might be connected to the group acquiring my company, and I felt a chill run down my spine even as I answered each question with careful, measured honesty. Then came the moment that changed everything. The servers had just cleared the plates when Callie, suddenly more formal, stood and tapped her glass. She announced that her company, Juno Real Estate Partners, was closing its largest ever acquisition the next morning, and that she'd spent 3 months working with an exceptional founder whose vision had reshaped the industry. She turned and looked directly at me, her voice strong as she asked, Paige, is it true that you're the founder of Nova Matrix? Every fork in the room seemed to freeze in midair. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, some filled with shock, others with thinly disguised skepticism. Brian choked on his wine, Mom looked genuinely confused, and Dad leaned forward, his hands folded tightly on the white tablecloth. For a long moment, nobody said a word, until I nodded, my heart pounding so loud that I thought everyone could hear it. Kelly explained to the table, in a voice that carried through the entire room, that Nova Matrix had been acquired for $275 million, that the company was already changing the way buildings operated across the Southwest, and that its AI systems were being studied by universities and featured in national tech journals. She looked at me with open admiration, saying that in all her years of corporate work, she'd never met a leader as determined or as visionary. The silence after her speech was absolute. Mom stared at me, her mouth open in shock, as if she was seeing me for the first time in a decade. Dad went pale, his hands trembling as he tried to ask how long I'd been building this little company. Brian looked hurt, his pride clearly shaken, while my cousins whispered frantically, some searching for Nova Matrix on their phones right at the table. For once, nobody interrupted me, nobody offered advice or asked about job leads. All eyes were on me, waiting for an explanation. I stood, my knees wobbling, and tried to keep my voice steady as I told them the truth. I described the years spent coding in garages and freezing apartments, the sleepless nights when Sierra and I wondered if we'd ever make payroll, the constant stream of rejections and closed doors. I told them about the patents, the magazine features, and the small but fierce team that had followed me across 3 states. I spoke of the loneliness and the grit, of Sierra's faith in our vision, and the stubborn belief that even a girl from Austin with no connections could change the world if she refused to quit. Then I told them what it was like to watch my parents brag about Brian, while hiding my acceptance letters to MIT and Stanford, to see my hard-won trophy used as a coaster, to hear Mom whisper to her friends that Paige just hasn't found her way. I looked at them all, each in turn, and explained that every single setback had taught me that validation couldn't come from family who never bothered to see me as I was. My voice broke only once. When I described the moment, I realized that my parents' pride was always conditional, and their respect could only be earned by following a path they'd chosen long before I was born. For a long time, nobody said anything. The only sound was the city, humming through the glass behind us. I looked down at my contract, still hidden in my purse, and felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. They finally saw me, but only because they'd run out of ways to look away. The silence after my speech stretched for what felt like an eternity, heavy and complicated, as if everyone at the table had forgotten how to move or breathe. For so many years, I had imagined what it might be like to have this moment, where every assumption and every dismissive word would finally fall apart in the harsh light of truth. Instead of triumph, what I felt was a cold, sharp ache, as if I had ripped open old wounds and was watching my family bleed surprise and shame across the expensive white linens. Mom was the first to break, her voice trembling as she said she only ever wanted what was best for me, but I could see in her eyes that what she really wanted was to control the outcome. Dad followed, his words stumbling over themselves as he tried to reframe the past, claiming that he had always believed in my potential, even as his memory betrayed him with stories that grew less accurate with every attempt at reassurance. My brother Brian just stared at his plate, unable to look at me or anyone else, the pride that had defined him suddenly replaced by something softer and uncertain. My aunts and uncles began to murmur among themselves, and I could hear my cousin whisper to her friend that maybe Paige was actually the smart one all along. The realization that my family had never truly seen me as I was hit me harder than any previous slight or insult, leaving me feeling both vindicated and desperately alone. For so long, I had craved their respect, but now, as I watched them struggle to recalibrate their stories, I realized that their approval would never mean what I once thought it would. Callie, who had just exposed the truth, gave me a private look of apology and admiration, and I nodded in silent thanks, grateful that at least someone in the room saw what I'd really done. The rest of the night moved in a blur, as if the world had shifted and nothing fit quite the same way it had before. My parents tried to salvage their dignity, telling anyone who would listen that they had always known I was destined for something important, but their words fell flat in the face of the facts. Some relatives approached me, asking for advice on investments or technology stocks, as if my sudden success might rub off on them by association. Sierra, who had been waiting in the lobby, met me in the hallway with a look of fierce pride. She hugged me tighter than anyone ever had, whispering that I didn't owe my family anything, not now, not ever. I clung to her, grounding myself in the presence of someone who had seen every struggle and every late-night panic, someone who had built this life alongside me, brick by digital brick. For the first time, I realized that family was not just something you are born into, but something you create through trust, effort, and shared pain. Back in the dining room, the conversation eventually shifted back to Brian's wedding and the safe topics that always seemed to comfort my parents: hospital politics, real estate, and charity auctions. I watched them revert to old habits, clinging to the roles that made them feel powerful and secure. I saw Mom try to position herself as the parent of a tech prodigy, weaving new stories about recognizing my brilliance early on, even as she avoided my gaze. Dad tried to take credit, too, telling an old friend that he had always encouraged Paige to take risks, even as he left out the years of silence and disappointment. I sat quietly, letting them talk, no longer needing to correct their narratives or demand acknowledgement. The pride I once longed for from them had finally arrived, but it was empty, built on the ashes of old wounds and desperate revisionist history. In that moment, I made peace with the idea that their recognition would always come too late and for the wrong reasons. The people who mattered, the people who had built Nova Matrix with me, who had sacrificed sleep, money, and stability to chase an impossible dream, were waiting for me outside this gilded, echoing room. As I prepared to leave, Brian finally approached me, his voice quiet and uncertain. He admitted he had never really understood what I was trying to do, that he'd assumed my choices were reckless or naive. Now, seeing what I had built, he said he wished he'd asked more questions and listened instead of judging. His apology, though late, felt real, and I found myself forgiving him, not because he'd earned it, but because I needed to let go of the anger that had shaped my entire adult life. Callie congratulated me once more before slipping away to finish wedding planning, her expression thoughtful. I realized, with a rush of gratitude, that sometimes it took an outsider to force a family to finally look inward and see each other honestly. On my way out, several cousins stopped to shake my hand and ask for business cards, hungry for proximity to success, but I offered only a smile and a polite nod, unwilling to trade what I had fought for just to make someone else's story brighter. When I stepped into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I had in years. The city below shimmered, alive with possibility, and I knew that Nova Matrix would soon be more than just my secret. It would be my legacy. I called Sierra and we walked through the quiet streets, sharing the victory in a way that words couldn't quite capture. I told her that, after tonight, I was done chasing approval from people who had never believed in my vision, and that the future would be shaped by the people who had actually helped me build it. For the first time, I understood that real validation comes from within, and that no amount of public recognition or family pride could compare to the pride I felt in what I had accomplished against all odds. As the city hummed around us, I let go of the need to prove myself to anyone but the woman who had survived every failure and celebrated every tiny win. Whatever happened next, I knew I had already won. 6 months passed in a kind of brilliant blur, and life in Houston became almost unrecognizable compared to the lonely nights and cheap dinners that had defined my 20s. The Nova Matrix team grew quickly, our little garage crew expanding into a real office with glass doors and a skyline view, every desk filled with the hum of ambition and second chances. Sierra and I held our heads higher than ever, no longer looking over our shoulders or wondering if the world would ever notice what we had built from the ground up. The recognition was exhilarating but strange, almost like slipping into someone else's life, a version of myself I had only dreamed about when I coded through Sunrise and wondered if the struggle would ever pay off. Despite all the press, the interviews, and the glowing industry features, my relationship with my parents shifted but never quite healed. They started following Nova Matrix online, sending links to articles about smart cities and AI, sometimes texting late at night to ask what my job actually meant. There were new invitations for Sunday dinners, and sometimes I went, answering questions about board meetings and product launches, letting them believe that we were finally becoming the kind of family that celebrated each other honestly. The truth, though, was that trust once broken is slow to return, and the wounds of those long years still shaped the way I measured their pride. Brian and Callie eventually married in a ceremony that felt like an elaborate apology for every slight and misunderstanding, and I stood beside them, not as the forgotten sister but as a peer and equal, someone who had forged her own place at the table. My parents introduced me differently now, as our daughter, the entrepreneur, but their words were always careful, as if they were still afraid of saying too much or too little. Even so, I let it go, learning to accept imperfect love and flawed attempts at connection, because holding on to the past would only keep me from living in the present I had worked so hard to claim. Nova Matrix continued to soar, and our client list stretched from Seattle to Miami, but with every new contract, I felt a tug to do something more meaningful with our success. I remembered the hungry nights and the way Sierra and I had almost given up more times than we could count. With her encouragement, I launched a program for girls in underserved communities, teaching them to code and build with the kind of fearless curiosity the world tries so hard to extinguish. The first time a 12-year-old girl from East Houston presented her own working app to a room full of engineers, I nearly cried, realizing that our true legacy would not be measured by revenue or headlines, but by the possibilities we unlocked in others. Just as I started to believe that the hardest battles were behind me, an unexpected email arrived in my inbox, one that changed everything in a single heartbeat. The subject line was just a string of numbers, but when I opened it, there was a scanned image of the MIT acceptance letter my parents had hidden years ago, along with a note written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. He apologized for what he called an unforgivable mistake, admitting that fear and pride had blinded him to the person I was trying to become. There was no request for forgiveness, only an acknowledgement of how much he had cost me, and a promise to support whatever I chose to do from that day forward. As I sat at my desk, staring at the letter and the apology I thought would never come, I realized that true closure rarely arrives in the ways we imagine. I called Sierra and read the note to her, and she laughed through tears, reminding me that our best revenge had always been the life we built, not the ones we left behind. I knew then that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, but about freeing myself to move forward unburdened. The next morning, a new storm rolled in, one I could never have predicted. Our lead engineer, Mark, called with a voice tight with anxiety, explaining that the Nova Matrix platform had detected a string of irregular access logs tied to Juno Real Estate Partners, the very company that had bought us out. At first, I thought it was just a technical bug or maybe an internal audit gone wrong, but the data was clear. Someone at Juno had been rerouting funds, using our own AI-driven systems to cover their tracks. I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck, realizing that the biggest success of my career was now tangled in a corporate crime I had helped expose. The decision weighed on me like nothing I'd ever faced, not the years of rejection or the heartbreak of my family's betrayal. If I stayed silent, Nova Matrix would keep growing, my name would stay clean, and my parents might finally believe in me without reservation. But if I blew the whistle, I would risk everything: the company's reputation, my newfound peace, and the fragile progress I had made with my family. I spent days torn between fear and principle, haunted by the idea that staying quiet would make me complicit in the very kind of corruption I had built Nova Matrix to disrupt. Late one night, with Houston's skyline flickering in the window, I called a journalist who had covered our early days, someone I knew would not twist the truth. I gave her the evidence, my hands trembling, but my voice clear. In the weeks that followed, headlines exploded, boardrooms erupted in chaos, and federal agents descended on Juno's offices. For a while, it felt like the world was collapsing, but deep down, I knew I had chosen the harder, braver path. In the aftermath, Nova Matrix weathered the storm, stronger than before, our reputation burnished by the willingness to do what was right, not just what was easy. My parents called, this time not with criticism or demands, but with pride and something like awe, finally seeing me not as the girl they failed to understand, but as a woman who had built something no one could ever take away. As I walked through the new Nova Matrix offices, watching the next generation of dreamers and coders at work, I finally understood that some endings are really just beginnings, and the only legacy that matters is the one you write yourself, one bold, imperfect step at a time.